And so it's a real pleasure today to introduce Senator Peter Welch today from Vermont. He has represented Vermont in the Senate since 2023. Before that, he was 16 years a representative in the House of Representatives for Vermont, and he served before that in the Vermont Senate since 1980. Senator Welch is the chair of the Subcommittee on Rural Development and Energy within the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition and Forestry, and he also sits on the Committee on Commerce, Science and Transportation and the Joint Economic Committee, among others. In his role on the JEC especially, the Senator has called for strengthening private and public partnerships to support job training and workforce development in green energy. And actually, during the negotiations of the IRA, he played a leading role in including a grant program for training contractors in the home energy efficiency sector, and we're going to talk about that today. And for anyone who loves hiking in this beautiful weather, I would ask you to check out his website. He has listed his favorite trails in Vermont that are obviously wonderful to explore during this time of the year. So please join me in welcoming the Senator up to the stage. All right, so Senator, I want to start with a topic that I'm sure you enjoy, which is Vermont. When we look at Vermont, it's a rural state. It is a state that has a workforce that is trending older. What kind of workforce development opportunities and challenges do you see in your state, especially as it relates to the green energy transition?
Well, you know, Vermont has the same challenges that any other state, is what you were saying in your opening. You know, this is the perspective I have. It was really hard, really hard to pass the Inflation Reduction Act. It was really difficult in Congress to actually take on climate change and acknowledge that it was real. And I served for many years in the House, and I went from when I first arrived to full-scale denial. There is no problem. And that eventually transitioned into not so much there was the denial of a problem, but a fear of the implications of trying to solve it. What will that mean to my community? What will that mean to my job? And ultimately, we were successful for the first time in the history of our country with the Inflation Reduction Act, where you have public policy incentives, $369 billion in policies that are focused on trying to bring down carbon emissions. That was hard. And I feel good to have been a part in getting that accomplished. But that wasn't the hard part. That's the reality. The implementation now is extraordinarily difficult because how do you now make the transition and implementation now has to achieve the goal of making clean energy options affordable for citizens, because that's the big issue. People will choose an option if it is within reach financially. And then how do you train the workforce and have the folks that you need in order to put the solar panels on, to insulate the homes, the technicians and electricians to improve the efficiency of the things that we're going to be using that save energy. You mentioned permit reform, which is not the topic here, but that is a huge challenge that we have. And for a lot of folks like me who've been environmentalists, the permit system was used, frankly, as a means of stopping, quote, bad projects. And now we have to get our heads around the fact that we have to have a permit system that is going to make it easier for us to build things so that we have good projects. But one of the big challenges, getting back to the topic of the day, is workforce development. And this is where we have a real challenge, not just in Vermont, but everywhere. You know, if you are going to be installing solar panels, if you are going to be doing EV batteries, and we've got companies in Vermont doing that. If you are a company like Beta Technologies, which is a great new Vermont company that is building these small electrically powered small planes, then you've got to get the workforce. And it's a combination, like you said, of having training that is available to younger people who are choosing as a career something other than college in what will follow after that, but taking advantage of the incredible skills that they have, but require training. And those can only be done if you get a couple of policies. Number one, there's got to be like public-private partnerships, because the skills may be general, but they have to have a place where that person, that young person who's learning these skills to be, say, an installer or working on the line at Beta Technologies, that they can learn those skills, but they have to then have the capacity and confidence that they get a job. And it means also that as they're trying to do that, there's got to be some support so they can earn while they learn. And I think there's a growing recognition that these are really good jobs for folks where they can make a good living and live in a community if they can afford housing, which we're not talking about today, but is really a big part of what the challenge is for all kinds of reasons. So that earn while you learn, the link between a company that has a need for workers and can play a very constructive role in the education of that workforce, and then the public resources that can go into supporting students who are making this choice. So new people going in and then reskilling is obviously very, very important. And we just an example in Vermont, we've got somebody who is a petroleum engineer and moved into the EV space. And it's obviously a person who's got significant skills that are transferable but require some training. So that has to be a major focus of public policy, having practical programs that work that do require, by definition, a partnership with industry that is taking advantage of the incentives. But in order to then actually build the products, distribute the products, they have to have the workforce that can do it. So one of the things that was in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Hope for Homes program, which is something that I worked on with Congressman McKinley from West Virginia, a Republican, where you were providing incentives to homeowners to essentially insulate their homes, save money, create local jobs. But we had $200 million in there for workforce training. And unfortunately, that's the only significant, pared down from $500 million, but it's the only significant money that actually went directly to training. So this topic that you're talking about today is incredibly important. Implementation can't happen without a pipeline of training, of workforce that's essential to do the work to accomplish this.
Thank you very much, Senator. You actually brought up the Hope for Homes Act, which is a great example. Can you talk a little bit about what it does? What was your motivation behind it? And are there any other workforce-related provisions in the IRA that relate to it?
Well, Hope for Homes was originated by this David McKinley I mentioned. He's from coal country in West Virginia, and he's a Republican, and he's an engineer. And this started many years ago. And it was when in Congress, as I mentioned, talking about climate change was like a four-letter word. And it's pretty bizarre, right? When you're talking to people and they're denying that climate change exists, but that was true. But and it was all about trying to protect the fuel source of the carbon economy, a whole variety of reasons. But what caused me to get into the Hope for Homes was that the one area where I found that I could get cooperation and real engagement from some of my Republican colleagues, including David, who was from coal country, was on efficiency, right? So whether you're using coal or oil or whatever fuel source, less is more. It's fewer carbon emissions, fewer dollars spent, and in the implementation of efficiency measures, it tended to create local jobs. So it was the one way where we were going to have some capacity in a bitterly divided Congress where there was denial, full scale, of climate consequences and carbon emissions causing problems, where you could actually get some bipartisan support. David was a fierce champion of this. So we were working on that for a number of years, got it through the House, didn't make it through the Senate. You know, the usual false starts. You make it, then you don't. You thought you had it, then you didn't. But ultimately, we were successful in getting this into the IRA. And it provides a tax incentive to homeowners to essentially do home insulation, home tightening efficiency measures in their homes. And by the way, you know, I was in the House when we passed Waxman-Markey, which, oh my goodness, we'd be so far ahead if we had gotten the, thank you, Joe Lieberman, if we'd gotten that passed in the Senate. We got it through the House. But that was going to be like an 80% reduction in carbon emissions, I think, by 2035. 40% of the reduction in emissions was going to come from efficiency. You know, efficiency is an incredibly powerful tool to help us achieve our carbon reduction goals. And, you know, I'm a Vermonter, so I'm pretty cheap. So spending less on, you know, home heating is pretty good. And that's an argument that I found appealing to many of my Republican colleagues.
No, I think this is a really great point because it also allows people to have the same standard of living, right? And even spend less, probably better because they spend less money on heating and other.
No, and it's local. I mean, so much of what we have to do to get carbon emissions down, it has to be, there's a variety of ways to do it, but ultimately there has to be a lot of local engagement because there's so many different ways in which we create carbon emissions or use them. But this is within reach for homeowners and businesses. Another thing we were working on was performance contracting, where you get a private sector making bids to essentially do energy efficiency measures in a public building, and that the private sector gets an estimate and then puts up the money that's required for the installation for the workforce and so on. And they get paid back over time, much like your utility bill, from the savings that are measurable. You know, you're going to pay that back over time. So that performance contracting approach was something that was very, very helpful as well. But, you know, the heart of this is, and this is an argument I was making that didn't persuade people, but is now being accepted. A major decision that any society has to make is, are you going to ignore the problems you face, or are you going to lean in and solve them, and in the course of solving them, make your society, make your economy stronger? And there's absolutely no question now that if we are committed in various ways to address the challenge of reducing carbon emissions and having a cleaner energy economy, that's going to create thousands and thousands of jobs. The estimate in IRA is 300,000 jobs. So, you know, that's what a confident nation does. That's what a confident person does. This is a problem. We've got to solve it. What do we have to do? But we've gotten that head start with the fact that the IRA is passed, the incentives are there, it's being taken up by the private sector. The amount of public investment, or pardon me, private investment in the area has exceeded the governmental investment. So what are the next challenges that we face in workforce development is really a major one that we have to take on with energy and determination.
So let's drill down a little bit on this, because I think it's really the key of the topic here. How can we make sure that we have enough skilled workers? And how can we rescale them? How can we upskill people that maybe don't have the skills currently? And what parts of our education system need to be reformed for that? As you mentioned earlier, I think one important aspect is that in the US, everyone is being pushed into the college system, which is different to a lot of European countries where you have these two tracks where people can go for vocational training, and oftentimes this provides very important skills for these types of jobs. So where do you see the biggest need for reform and the biggest need for investment and policy measures?
Well, I think those skill courses have to be integrated into regular high school. I think that's really absolutely vital. You know, we're rebuilding our high school in Burlington, Vermont, and it is going to have a much more of an opportunity for students to make a choice and to do both as they're going through college. And in fact, the head of this Beta Technologies, which is an extraordinarily promising company, went to Harvard, but he went to Essex High School. And in the morning, he went to the college ed portion of Essex High School. It's in Vermont, right near Burlington. In the afternoon, he went to what in the old days would be called the trade school section. And he loved both and has an aptitude in both. So this is a person who went to Harvard, MIT, and but when I asked him about what he liked the most out of his education, it was when he was in the Essex Technical Center in the afternoon. So that integration, I think, is what's really, really important. You know, if it's right there, especially when you're younger, you know, school a lot of times is the last thing you're thinking about. But when you have the option to actually do things with your hands, to be with other people who are finding a way to feel good and confident about themselves, that's like the key to learning. Because then you start taking the motivation to do it yourself, not just learn from others, or not just sit in a classroom. And so that's got to be, I think, baked into what is available. It's in the school curriculum in Vermont and elsewhere around the country.
That's very interesting. And I know you've talked a lot about in your career about private-public partnerships, especially in that context. Can you talk a little bit about kind of like what models you have seen that work, or models that we could pursue to help with the workforce development?
Well, you know, the IRA is an example. In order to, the job we should have when you're in Congress is to have public policies that make it possible, more possible, for people back home to be successful in what they're doing, right? But the implementation is never going to be here. It's always got to be where you are. And micromanaging here is always a failure. So the more you push the responsibility back to the local communities, or the more you create policies so that those that capital can flow to opportunities that are made available because of public policy providing an incentive, then you have companies that are about delivering a service, who need employees who have to be trained and be reliable and have a skill to be able to efficiently deliver that product or make that product. That's a public-private partnership. So the public part of this is public policy. The private part of this is, you know, the way our economy works with small businesses, with larger businesses, but what decisions those businesses make, or what decisions like my wife Margaret and I made about doing energy efficiency work in our house was very much affected by a bottom line calculation. Is this going to save us money or it isn't? And absent the public policy incentives, it wouldn't have saved us money, and we probably wouldn't have done it, even though it was, quote, the right thing to do. So that's what I mean about a public-private partnership.
Great, and I think one model that I'd like to talk a little bit about is, because we got many audience questions online about this, is apprenticeship programs. What is your view of those programs? Does Vermont have any programs for apprenticeship, and what has the experience been that you have seen across the U.S.?
Well, we do. You know, number one, apprenticeship programs go back right to the Renaissance. I mean, this is not a new idea. And unfortunately, we've abandoned it. Because in order to learn a skill in a trade, you need to spend time doing it. You need to spend time with folks who have done it. And the big challenge is that if you're a young person, you're getting started, and you don't have an income, how are you going to survive during the apprenticeship program without some public support? in Vermont, there's been a couple of examples of some of our community foundations raising money and some of our employers raising some money, and the state coming up with some money, working with some employers who had a severe need to get trained workforce to allow essentially earn while you learn opportunities. And that has to be part of it. And that, again, is an area where there's a public-private partnership. If the company pardon me, is going to be able to have the employees it needs, it's got to train them, it's got to put some skin in the game. Pardon me, but there's a real interest is for the public to have some skin in the game too. Pardon my cough.
Take your time.
Go ahead.
So then, I think one important concern that we always hear is when we talk about the green energy transition is, what about all those states that have fossil fuel jobs, well-paying fossil fuel jobs? You mentioned the petrochemical engineer before. What do you tell your colleagues in those states? Kind of like, how can we help workers transition from those kinds of roles, which are often very different, to the new ones in the clean energy economy?
You know, in all candor, I don't tell them anything. If you're in Texas, you're in West Virginia, and you've got some coal workers, you care about them. And I don't give them the lecture. But if you give them a factory, I'll give an example. You know, huge EV battery factory being built in Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. So this is not about telling, it's about doing. Folks in that Georgia district who want a good job are really excited about it. And they're not thinking about climate change necessarily, they're thinking about taking care of their family, being able to put clothes on the backs of their kids, having good meals. So this is where there's going to be a transition, but it's not like you can ever talk the folks who have come in a community dependent on fossil fuel jobs, that those are wrong. But you can provide opportunities so that folks have a chance to accomplish what all of us want, and that is to have a good, meaningful job where we think we're helping ourselves and our family and our community. I'll give you a quick story. David McKinley, I mentioned, he lives in West Virginia. I went down to his house and spent the night, and then we went into the West Harrison mine. I got on one of those elevators. You go down 1,000 feet and then got on one of those little coal cars, go 4.5 miles in. And David annoyed me there because we were with the union miners, and like 3 miles in, they turned all the lights off. It was dark. So anyway, we came out, and I'm sitting around, and we're having a meal with the miners, and I was just asking them what they're doing this weekend. And they were telling me they go to the football games, the high school football games. About 10 years before this, there were 8 high schools in the area. Now there was only 3, okay? So these are, and by the way, these folks work hard. And the only people I know who work as hard as these coal miners were the dairy farmers in Vermont. So, you know, am I going to tell them that they ought to, you know, become computer coders? Am I going to not have empathy for the anxiety that that family feels when they see stores closing up in the community and high schools closing down? No. But let's say we can get some new jobs and new investment in the community. They can add to the tax base and maybe renovate the high school and have some local agency. So I think there's got to be an immense amount of respect for the everyday person who has been in fossil fuel industries and has worked as hard as dairy farmers or worked as hard as any of us in any of our jobs for the same reasons that all of us do. We want to have some dignity in work. We want to be able to take care of our families and contribute to our communities. But this is why the IRA is so constructive, because it's creating these other opportunities, like in the Marjorie Taylor Greene district, some really good paying, accessible jobs for the people in that community so they can achieve their personal goals, but you're not asking them to stop doing the only job that's available to them.
I love that point, because I think oftentimes when we look at that debate, it's driven by ideologues and often very acrimonious. But as you said, it's like we have to be respectful, right? We have to acknowledge that the fossil fuel economy was a big part of our economy, still is, and these people have jobs that provide us with a good and service, and we need to find a good way to transition.
That has to be part of it. You know, I had a wonderful time in West by God, Virginia. People been down there? Well, I didn't know that. I thought it was just West Virginia. But when you come in or when you leave, it's West by God, Virginia. So, but there was a big union gathering. And the folks there, by the way, they work in the mines, and then the mines go bankrupt, or the companies do, and the workers who had, they thought they had health care benefits, they get lost in bankruptcy, and their retirement got lost in bankruptcy. Now, I worked with David to change that, and we were ultimately successful. But what I so admired about being there was how dedicated those folks were to their community. And I think there's got to be that awareness all around, even as we make this transition. And at the end of the day, you know, this affordability question is really important. So we're not going to win the battle of hearts and minds by explaining to people that you're being virtuous if you somehow find a way to buy an electric vehicle you can't afford. We got to make the electrical vehicle affordable, okay, in all the way down the line.
I love that point, and I might call you back for another event in the future, because we've been thinking about that cost of living and climate policy. I want to turn to like an audience question, because I know you have to leave at 1:55, which is going to combine two questions here, which are very interesting. As you know, as we talked about, we often face a shortage of workers. At the same time, we also see declining birth rates in states across the U.S., including Vermont. So what role do you think immigration can play in building up the workforce that we need? And do we also need international cooperation to learn from different training models? I know in Europe, for instance, they've had much longer experience with apprenticeship programs. What kind of like factor does the international connectivity play here?
Well, two things. Number one, I do believe we need more legal, and I'll emphasize legal immigration. Legal immigration is, you know, who's coming, and it acknowledges that we have a need to have immigration be part of our ability to have the workforce that we need, okay? And you can be for strong borders and for generous legal immigration. The two can go hand in hand, and I think that compromise bill that was negotiated in the Senate between a conservative Republican and a liberal Democrat and an independent was a really good bill. So my hope is that we could come back to having that combination of a secure border and more legal immigration. That'll help a lot. And then, obviously, if there are other models about how workforce training can be improved, and there's a lot of room for improvement because we don't have that big tradition in this country, then yes, by all means, let's look elsewhere. But where I'm seeing it really work is when it's just there's a real practical connection. You know, I keep mentioning Beta, but it's just an inspiring example in Vermont. They've got great leadership in the company. They've got a great plan. They seem to be doing extremely well. They need workers. And that's a place where young people can go, if we can make it affordable for everybody, to get the training they need and then get integrated into a job that can ultimately turn into a pretty long-term career for them.
That's a really great point. Thank you. And I love your point on the immigration debate, because I think the majority of Americans are on that point, right? We want a secure border. We want to reduce illegal immigration. We have to look where are the gaps for legal immigration that we can fill. So we're almost out of time. So last question is, obviously going forward, we don't know how the election's going to go, how the new Congress is going to look like. But if you could design your dream programs for workforce development, dream legislation, what are some of the things that might be coming down the line in the next few years?
The federal government should be providing the incentives. But as I mentioned, I think in order for this to work, if you have the incentives, you're going to have local companies working with local schools to have skills that are oriented around real local job opportunities. And that might be chips in one place, it might be electric batteries in another place, but that integration, I think, is what will make the difference, because there's got to be realistic connection between the work you're doing to learn and then the opportunity you get as a result of the learning to have a real job that pays a real wage and has real opportunity. So I think the incentives from the federal government are very helpful, and then the state and local employers working very, very closely together to match the needs of the employer with the skills that are trained by the school or the school/private sector company partnership apprenticeship program.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all very much.